Also had something else, which again is very much in common with modern day veterans. They had an obligation to the United States. They also had an obligation to their brothers in arms who did not survive. I'm sure you've heard the term survivor guilt. You may not have heard the term survivor obligation. Survivor guilt dissipates, and survivor obligation becomes a very powerful force for veterans because they're the ones who carry on the legacy of those who did not return. Okay, welcome everybody. This is Dr. Stephen A. Goldman, author of One More War to Fight, which is a story that tells two previously untold stories, both of which are intertwined. How Northern veterans, black and white, fought a second war seeking equality for all Americans, and in the process created the model of civic commitment based on military service that American citizen soldiers, Marines, sailors, and air personnel have emulated in modern times. And what I do in this book is, for the first time, tell the story of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Lost Cause, and literally the 50 years after the Civil War, utilizing both the Grand Army of the Republic and a unique lifelong study of the national cohort of white Union soldiers and sailors, which originated from a one-shot attempt at occupational therapy, which was a handwriting contest, national handwriting contest that was put together right after the war was ending, in which 268 battle-hardened Union veterans who had lost use of their right hands or arms in combat were asked for a writing sample using their left hands. And instead of simply submitting a handwriting sample, they submitted incredible essays about everything that had gone on during the war, combat, African-American soldiers, slavery, defending the Republic, literally everything except for one taboo topic, which was and remains in some ways what it means to kill in war. What I did with this papers from the Library of Congress, to which I was introduced by my dear friend, Dr. John Sellers, was I tracked down all 268 men through records at the National Archives, because all of them have been disabled, a lot of other material, which I won't get into. And I found them to be highly representative and essentially indistinguishable from the 2 million other white Northern volunteers at enlistment and during their wartime service. Now, while they're a tremendously representative sample, they were 98% enlisted men as they entered the service. There were two African Americans, both of them from the 5th United States Colored Troops, the 5th USCT. One of them I'm going to talk about a lot today, which is Sergeant Robert Pinn. The other one was Sergeant William Hannibal Thomas, both from the same company. Now, in addition to the Left Arm Corps, in addition to the Grand Army of the Republic, my book and my research entails essentially all Union veterans, both solely and as a group. Now, as someone who has spent his career working with veterans of military service and war, I want to make clear that the experience of Union veterans, black and white, is emblematic of the experience of service and combat in modern wars. And the men of the Union who had gone to war was initially in the first, before the Emancipation Proclamation was finalized and put out on January 1st, 1863, and under the Second Militia Act, they were almost exclusively white soldiers. When African-American troops came into the armies, and up to 180,000 served in the armies of the Union, interestingly enough, African-Americans had been serving in the navies of the Union all the way throughout the war. The initial hostility from white troops for African-American troops, frankly, soon abated as they saw the tremendous skill, persistence, and valor of African-American soldiers when they finally got the chance to fight. And this tremendous change in the attitude towards white soldiers would lead to a respect for their black comrades in arms that would have tremendous impact during Reconstruction and well beyond. Now, why is that? Because the experience of combat eliminates any differences among those who are in combat, as so many of them talked about both during and after the war, that the colors weren't white and black, the colors were red. And this was something that we've seen in modern times, which again I'll talk about later. So what happened with the Civil War, which was a unique war in many ways, two things that made it particularly unique. The stated goal of the war was the preservation of the Union. Midway, the stated goal became, frankly, even more elevated, and that was the destruction of slavery. That aspect completely changed during the war, and it was the men of the Union, white and black, who were radicalized by their experience of combat and their war experience, which again, we've seen time and again in American wars. So the question that I sought to answer in this book was the irrevocable changes that take place in those who go to war. Would that lead to the maintenance of dedication of black and white Northern veterans to the causes for which they battled and bled? And would they continue to struggle not only for freedom, but for the true unfinished work of the Civil War, which became equality for all Americans? And would that special barrier-shattering brotherhood that I mentioned before, that forms among those who risk everything together, continue in the absence of war? And based on my in-depth research, my experience as a psychiatrist who has worked for the VA and has worked with veterans over 4 decades, my answer is emphatically yes. Now, one of the most important aspects that those who go to war have is the warrior identity. And in a seminal paper written in the aftermath of the Vietnam War by psychiatrist Sam Bradshaw, psychologist Carol Oldie, and psychiatrist James B. Horn, who was actually a World War II veteran, all at the Topeka, Kansas VA, they describe a warrior identity that entails the positive impact on the lives of veterans in the post-war period due to such attributes that they've learned during military service: discipline, bravery, the ability to tolerate considerable distress in achieving an aim. And this has a tremendous impact on how veterans view themselves and how they reintegrate into society. And let me make this clear. The vast majority of those who have served, including and particularly those who have been in combat, transition to civilian society quite successfully. And we can talk more about that. Nobody personified this more than the black and white Union veterans, because they had fought for reasons that ennobled the country. They also had, through their resilience, post-traumatic growth, the sustaining and sustained power of this warrior identity, and the awareness that their work was hardly finished when the guns went silent in 1865. They also had something else, which again is very much in common with modern day veterans. They had an obligation to the United States. They also had an obligation to their brothers in arms who did not survive. I'm sure you've heard the term survivor guilt. You may not have heard the term survivor obligation. Survivor guilt dissipates, and survivor obligation becomes a very powerful force for veterans, because they're the ones who carry on the legacy of those who did not return. Now, what did these aspects promote in Union veterans? Outstanding service in the Freedmen's Bureau, which was vital to Reconstruction. Arguably, the most successful aspect of Reconstruction was the Freedmen's Bureau. Bitter opposition to Andrew Johnson's racial policies and associated grand scale activism of veterans. In the first two chapters of my book, I have brand new material on the soldiers' conventions in the midterm election of 1866, which was a referendum on the 14th Amendment. And then in 1868, when Grant ran for president, the referendum was not just on Grant, it was on the 15th Amendment, which gave the vote to African American males. Battling the Klan and its atrocities. A great example of that, I don't deal with almost an entire chapter on a member of the Left Armed Corps by the name of Joseph Riley Gelray, who was the Freedmen's Bureau's foremost investigator of the Klan. Fascinating man. It's a wonderful picture of him leading off the chapter. And then there was the Grand Army of the Republic. Because the Grand Army of the Republic and its members formed a stalwart bloc in support of landmark Republican initiatives on behalf of African Americans fighting bigotry and racism in two particular areas on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. That is quality public education and social equality. And again, I'll talk in depth about this and the tremendous role that the Grand Army played in this. Now, the Grand Army was the largest, most influential, and longest-lived Union military association. I would argue that the Grand Army of the Republic was the most influential veterans organization in American history. As many of you know, it began in August 1866, and 7 months later, at the first National Convention, the mission was defined: to maintain in civil life those great principles for which it stood in arms against the national flag, to vindicate everywhere and at all times the full and complete rights of every loyal American citizen against all combinations of force or fraud that may attempt to deny or deprive them of such rights. Now, the Grand Army decided to become nonpartisan, officially apolitical, because they were concerned about the destructive effect of partisanship. But be in no doubt that mission statement and later statements, earlier and later, made it abundantly clear where the Grand Army stood with respect to Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. Now, in terms of the size of the Grand Army, there were two peaks, as you know. In the late 1860s, early 70s, it petered out to almost disappearing, and then had its greatest numbers in the 1880s and through 1890, with in 1890 over more than 400,000 members and over 7,000 posts. Now, it is estimated that approximately half of all Union veterans, 1.3 million Union veterans, were members at some point in their lives. Now, the Left Armed Corps, which I mentioned before, was matched with the Grand Army. 50%, 70% of them belonged to the Grand Army, starting with its inception. They were active participants at all ranks and levels. And in political affiliation, the Left Armed Corps mirrored both Union veterans overall and certainly the Grand Army members by being disproportionately Republicans. And again, in those years, they were the progressives. So among the 149 of the Left Armed Corps members for whom I could find party membership, 94% were Republicans, which a affiliation they maintained for the rest of their lives. Of the 106 GAR members within the Left Armed Corps, all but 5 were Republicans. So in terms of my conclusions in the book, and others I'll have in books to follow, both the Left Armed Corps and the Grand Army Republic were highly typical, highly representative of Union veterans overall, and also bolsters my findings and conclusions in my research. Now, what did it mean to be Republican after the end of Reconstruction? Well, according to Eric Foner, quote, 1897 confirmed the growing conservatism of the Republican Party and portended a new role for the national state in the post-Reconstruction years. Nonetheless, the humanitarian impulse that helped create the Republican Party, nor the commitment to equal citizenship that evolved during the War and Reconstruction, did not entirely disappear. And again, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Left Armed Corps, are great manifestations of that. Now, why did they continue to be self-identified as predominantly Republican? Because it was indicative of their belief that political activism was critical to maintaining what had been achieved through war. Now, let's be clear what had been achieved through the Civil War. When Lincoln talked about the unfinished work during the Emancipation Proclamation, the unfinished work, the Gettysburg Address, the unfinished work was freedom. That is the destruction of slavery and freedom for 4 million African Americans who were enslaved. The unfinished work after the war was equality, work that remains unfinished. And an example of the ongoing political activism of Union veterans was in 1880 with another member of the Left Arm Corps, Anselm Smith, in upstate New York. They put out a reminder that your work was not done in 1865, but it continued through 3 successful political campaigns crowned with the affirmative suffrage of the nation. Again, reference to the 15th Amendment, and they came right to the point. 1,000 generals of the Union Army could not palliate nor annul the terrors and bloodshed with which the Democratic Party has unitized and again sets in the field a solid South against the patriotic volunteers of the peace-loving North. The struggle is again upon us. It's our country that calls. This could not be clearer, because as Reconstruction failed, as it ended, it didn't totally fail. And one of the things I point out in my book, and I'm doing a lot of talks about, is the tremendous impact that Reconstruction had in places for which it was not originally designed. In particular, states in the North and some of the border states, because there was tremendous progress in places such as Ohio, Illinois, and Kansas, where schools that had been segregated started to become integrated based on legislation that took place during Reconstruction. But it was offset by the encroachments of Jim Crow after Reconstruction failed and as things got worse. And an example of that is what happened when the Civil Rights Act, which was being utilized to protect African Americans in using public conveniences, in being able to utilize that for education, was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1883 because the decision said that it was unconstitutional because Congress lacked the authority to enact the Civil Rights Act, under either the 13th or 14th Amendment. What did that mean? It meant that African Americans could no longer rely on federal courts and on federal government for justice and compensation from discrimination, but now they had to rely on the very same states that had passed Jim Crow restrictions on their access to accommodations and privileges. As Joe Packard observed so fittingly, quote, "It was utterly unsurprising. This decision opened the floodgates to a sharp increase in the growth of Jim Crow." Now, what about the Grand Army? What did the Grand Army offer for African American veterans? It offered things that, frankly, were revolutionary. The Grand Army engendered fear when it first was founded, because there were certain Americans in the North who were frightened by the Grand Army of the Republic for a couple of reasons. It admitted African Americans, which was unique among any national association in the United States in the 19th century. That was what was quite unique about the Grand Army. We'll talk more about it. Secondly, not only were African American veterans pressing for full equality, they were getting tremendous support from their white comrades. And as the nation's largest and most conspicuously biracial organization, the Grand Army found itself under intense scrutiny. Everything they did was viewed nationwide and covered nationwide. Now, the Grand Army did not have its own official newspaper, contrary to popular belief. The National Tribune was not an arm of the Grand Army. However, it was a terrific newspaper. It did service ex-Union servicemen and their families, and its reporting on both the Grand Army and veteran affairs was absolutely superb, but it was not an arm of the Grand Army. All the other coverage on the Grand Army, fair or not, was a focus, in particular, on the fact that this organization was unique in the United States because there was no official color line. Therefore, anything the Grand Army did would be viewed under a microscope. Why? Because if the men who had fought together, if white Northern veterans did not support their black brothers, then why would anyone expect anyone else to support African Americans? And people were watching this. And that brought up two questions. If they did not receive support from their fellow white comrades, what would that mean for the advancement of African Americans as the new century approached? And what was indeed going to be the goal? Would integration not be the goal? Or would blacks and whites stay within their own communities, schools, places of worship, and associations? And be in no doubt, that was a situation in most places in the United States. It was separate. Now, I had mentioned Robert Pinn as one of the two African-American members of the Left Arm Corps. A remarkable man. He was also one of two African-Americans in the Mazatlan, Ohio Heart Post. And he became its commander. And he was adamant about the Grand Army's role as an integrative association in the United States. Now, what's interesting about Robert Pinn, a lot of things interesting about Robert Pinn, but even in his own county, Stark County, Ohio, there was a newspaper called the Stark County Democrat, which used horrible racial epithets and used demeaning dialect to African Americans, yet he was treated with considerable respect. There is little doubt that his status as an attorney, as one of the first African American Medal of Honor recipients, and being college educated, had a great influence in that. With all that, Robert Pinn was acutely aware of the racism that continued to plague the country. He was born and raised in Ohio, raised a free man in Ohio, but a second-class citizen in Ohio, because Ohio had black laws, which Pinn helped to repeal. And when he worked as a principal in the colored school in Cairo, Illinois, Southern Illinois, he learned firsthand what separate but equal really meant. But with all that, he'd gotten a terrific education at Oberlin, where his regimental commander was a professor and a close friend. He had close white friends and clients, and he was held in great esteem in his community. As I mentioned, he was installed as the commander of the Heart Post. And a major black newspaper, the Cleveland Gazette, always reported about Robert Pinn because they saw him as representative of the regard that African-American troops were held in by their colleagues. Then, in November 1886, he read in the Cleveland Gazette about plans for an all-black GAR post. He responded almost immediately, and he was outraged at the idea that there would be an all-black post. As he said, there are more than a half dozen posts in the city, colored troops members, some of them, I believe any colored soldier was worthy would be received. Why set up a sideshow? How long will my people persist in drawing a color line? I'm ashamed of them. As soldiers, we are all working for the same great object. Why not work together? We fought side by side with our white comrades. Our blood mingled and drenched the southern soil. Our united efforts saved our common country for the abode of free men. And now in this sublime time of peace, we should not be the first to say we will have no part with our white comrades. It is an insult to our comrades and a slander upon the Grand Army. I hope I will hear no more about colored posts. Now, some might think this was simply an idealistic pipe dream, but it wasn't. Barbara Gannon's research findings showed that there indeed were black veterans being turned down by admission to posts, and there were egregious examples of that. On the other hand, there were hundreds of GAR posts throughout the country that actively sought members. And although the majority, actually the vast majority, of veterans within the Grand Army were white, and they indeed dominated those organizations, as I'll point out, African Americans, while in a minority, fully participated in post life, particularly, as I'll show, in the North and Midwest. Now, this was completely the opposite of contemporary mores. And Pinn's concept matched Gannon's observation that an interracial post represented the GAR members' greatest aspirations to create an organization where veterans of every race, creed, or ethnicity could come together. Now, what Gannon found, and I'll say this very briefly, there were geographic variations in acceptance of integration. And interestingly, she found there were very few, relatively few, mixed race posts in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, as opposed to the Midwest. And she proposed the fact that may well have been is where the veterans had served, because the vast majority of African American troops actually served in the Western Theater, not in the Eastern Theater. And she felt, and I tend to agree with Barbara, that those who had fought in the same wars would be much more likely, same battles, would be much more likely to have something in common, and therefore find themselves much more welcome. And there is evidence of this. And the aspect of that would be, again, the bond that's formed, the unbreakable bond that's formed between those who have served together. Now, bear in mind, although African Americans served in segregated units, whether or not they were in the USCT or the few states such as Massachusetts and Iowa that had black regiments, they served in separate units. However, they fought side by side with white troops. And by the way, among the Left Arm Corps, I found exactly what Barbara Gannon found in terms of the integrated posts, depending on the geographic distribution. Now, Donald Schaffer, who wrote a terrific book about the relationship between black troops and their white officers, and he found that because equality for black veterans was at the heart of how they judged their progress as men, they valued the idea of racial equality espoused by the GAR, even if the reality didn't always measure up. He felt, as I do, that surprisingly, to a surprising extent, most white veterans did accept black Americans in the Grand Army and in the political life of the Grand Army. Now, there was a glass ceiling for their leadership. And that glass ceiling, which both Gannon and I found, was junior vice commander. She found junior vice commanders in Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana departments, and one in Pennsylvania. I found two more, both of whom were in the Department of Delaware, including William H. Jones, who was a man who was previously enslaved. In Ohio, the only black junior vice commander was, unsurprisingly, Robert Pinn. Robert Pinn had been the president of the state encampment for 5 years. He was a member of the departmental staff. And then in April 1888, by acclamation and the highest majority of any of the posts elected that year to the department's leadership, he was elected junior vice commander of the Department of the Ohio. When he returned back to Mazatlan, people almost shook off his one good arm, and they were absolutely thrilled for him. He did a terrific job as junior vice commander, but like all the other African-American men who became junior vice commanders, he never served another term as junior vice commander, nor did he, nor any of the other African-Americans follow the path that most white junior vice commanders followed, which is where they became the either the senior or the actual commander of the department itself. Having said that, Pinn was appointed to be a national aide-de-camp in 1889, and he brought along another Buckeye who happened to be former President Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, there were many reasons why there were African-American posts, and they weren't all based on racism. A lot of it was based on which communities they were in, because many African-American posts were formed in northern cities, which had African American neighborhoods, and they tended to form their own organizations within both, the local branches and certainly within the state departments. And they valued their collective military experience, and they took great pride in that. But they took tremendous pride in being part of the GAR. And there were times they had to make that pride abundantly clear. And one striking example of that occurred in 1885 when Ulysses S. Grant died. Now, while this did not originate from the Grand Army or anyone in authority, the men in New York's all-black GR post were offended when they were asked to serve as grooms in his funeral parade. As one member stated, they were comrades of the dead general, not servants, had been placed by Grant at the front of battles where they acquitted themselves with great courage. As a group, they made it abundantly clear they would appear in the procession as opposed to the Grand Army, which has never blushed for the conduct of its colored troops. That's exactly what happened. They got full support from their white colleagues, and they marched of the veteran guard in the Grand Procession to honor the general ex-president, who, as you may well know, has now gotten a deserved reevaluation for the great work done, particularly in his first administration, to battle the Klan. Two other illustrative examples of how race was permeating the United States were both in 1889. And this first one came out in the National Tribune. Henry Johnson was a black member of the Zook Post number 11 in Norristown, Pennsylvania. And he died in the almshouse, in Montgomery Almshouse. His comrades took custody of the body, and all they wanted to do was get him buried. But graveyard officials refused to allow their friend to be buried. Place was found for him in another cemetery, but they made it crystal clear what they felt about Montgomery's actions. The refusal to permit the burial of the body on account of a color of a man is bad enough. But just think, the pet dog of a family named Steinmetz was buried in that cemetery with great pomp. A daily newspaper last week very probably headed an article, "Dead Dogs Preferred, a cemetery draws the line at the Negro veteran." This was not the Deep South. This was Pennsylvania. On the other hand, Troy, New York, published an article that did reflect negatively on the Grand Army. There was a large post, Pratt Post number 127 in Kinston, New York, which had been disbanded. And they had several members of the post who were African American, all of whom were taken in and welcomed into another post. However, when one of the wives of the new member of this other post was proposed for membership in the Women's Relief Corps, she was blackballed. Because the members of that organization said it was well enough for the veterans, white and black, to associate together, but as to having a colored woman in their ranks was out of the question. Or when these things would appear in the newspapers, and by the way, that's a Republican newspaper, this was manna for heaven from Northern Democrat and Southern publications about the hypocrisy of the North. And these are the kinds of examples they utilized. So that what became vital, which I'll address in the last 10 minutes, and I do want to open the questions. Historian John D. Smith classified the 1890s as America's worst period with respect to race. Quote, "Separate and unequal, backed by the constant threat of racial violence, characterized the Jim Crow South, setting a discordant tone for race relations throughout the United States. North and South, the nation was obsessed with race and racial distinctions." So what happens? The Grand Army, under these conditions, in full view of the entire country, faces its greatest crisis over the country's most inflammatory and polarizing issue. As I describe in great detail in the book, and I'm not going to go into all the details, I will mention that of all things that led to the Grand Army having a showdown over whether or not there should be a color line in the Grand Army was Jefferson Davis's funeral in December 11th, 1889, because it tied into the long-standing racial problems in the Department of Louisiana and Mississippi. Things went bad to worse about what was going on in Louisiana and Mississippi Department when the National Tribune in October 1890 published a stunning announcement that it was being considered that there would be a separate colored department modeled on the USCT that would admit Black veterans from the entire South, if not the entire nation. In Florida, Fred Goodrich was dumbfounded when he read that because he was the department commander of Florida. He had never heard of this proposal. He was outraged by this proposal. And by the way, bear in mind, Florida was a Jim Crow state. Goodrich said it was outrageous that anyone would even consider such a thing because, and his language, which I won't read in its entirety, you can read in the book, he said exactly what Robert Pinn said. He said, we have absolutely no problems in the meetings. We have Black members of white posts or integrated posts. We've never turned down anybody who was honorably discharged and deserving. And he thought it was outrageous that anyone would even suggest such a thing, because that was antithetical to the precepts of the Grand Army. This was the harbinger to what happened when the 25th annual encampment meets in August 1891. The whole country is watching. And the night before, the members of the committee that would release a report as to what the recommendation would be, whether there should be a separate color department and whether or not there should be a color line, it was made abundantly clear to all the members of that committee that the rank and file adamantly opposed any such changes in the Grand Army of the Republic. So what happened was that when they met the following day, and the committee was a 5-member committee to make recommendations to the commander-in-chief. 3 former commanders-in-chiefs themselves and a former commander of the Department of Connecticut fully supported African-American members of the Grand Army. In a powerful, moving statement, they adamantly refused to accept a racial divide within the organization. Quote, during that fierce struggle for the life of the nation, we stood shoulder to shoulder as comrades tried. It is too late to divide now on the color line. A man who was good enough to stand between the flag and those who would destroy it when the fate of the nation was trembling in the balance is good enough to be a comrade in any department of the Grand Army of the Republic. No different rule has been or ever will be recognized by the survivors of the Union Army and Navy. No department should be established for any color or nationality. The ensuing dialogue that took place, and again, I've got transcripts, and I really point you to them. They were distinguished by their honesty, solemnity, and high emotion. As veterans from the West and border states, former border states, explained why they stood with the majority report. Then there was very persuasive testimony from 2 African-American delegates. Robert Johnson of the Department of the Potomac said, why do you want to shove us off to a separate department? We've always been one department. And of all the institutions we belong to, no other institution has brought us so near together as the Grand Army of the Republic. As white and Black soldiers have been friends and brothers together in the field, Johnson insisted that staying one department was imperative, even if separate posts were needed in the South. Pointing to the nation's worsening race problem, he asked, if you turn your back on us, whom shall we look to? Where shall we go? Seeing honesty, principle, charity, and loyalty among his comrades, he did not think such a thing would ever happen. Edward Ritchie of Kentucky spoke proudly of the successful incorporation of Black posts, 15% of all the posts in his department that were initially hostile to having Black membership. Emphatically stating that African-American veterans wanted no part of a separate department, he conveyed their belief that such a move would result in exclusion from state encampments, ostracism, and eventual removal from the Grand Army altogether. Linking the stormy racial climate and collective African-American warrior identity, Ritchie said, we know something of hard times, and we know just what it is to be Grand Army men. He expressed hope he could return to Kentucky, say to his comrades that the national encampment will stand by the colored comrades all over this land. Then something happened which showed how unique the Grand Army of the Republic was in late 19th century America. The dissenting member of the committee interrupted Ritchie as he was speaking. Ritchie shot back, you are one of the ducks that hide their badges down our way when you're flirting with the Democrats. According to Washington, D.C.'s Evening Star, this brought down the house, and the uproar was terrific. And again, how unusual was the Grand Army of the Republic in 1891 America? Where else could a black man display, this is my observation, open hostility to a white man in front of hundreds of people and be celebrated for it? This was 1891. 1896, the Supreme Court makes its second worst decision in its history, the only one being worse being Dred Scott in Plessy versus Ferguson, which institutes Jim Crow as the law of the land, setting civil rights back for decades. In the last few minutes, I'll point out that the reaction of the nation was immediate and unmistakable. There's an expression from the Vietnam era of hearts and minds. Everybody was watching what the Grand Army was going to do. And the Grand Army, justifiably, was praised for making it clear where they stood and what they stood for. And several of the newspapers compared the Grand Army, as in one case talking about an organization composed of men extremely religious, irreligious, or no religion, and that the churches of the time were segregated. And they pointed out this hypocrisy. Very soon in the same month, another Union veteran organization, the Union Veterans Union, 75,000 strong, made the same decision, refusing to draw any color line. The African American press was in particular interested in what would happen. And in a fascinating account, the Sacramento Daily Record Union reported that the African Methodist Episcopal, the AME Church Conference, had already put out a statement criticizing the Grand Army for its decision that they had to retract when they found out that the Grand Army had done exactly the opposite of what they were expecting. And they were absolutely thrilled. And they wired William Warner, who was one of the members of the committee, to express their deep gratitude, as did other African American newspapers and organizations. So, as I finish up, I do want to make clear that this did not eliminate ongoing incidences of African Americans being blackballed from organizations. There were worse problems, by the way, in Texas and other places. But myself, Schaffer, others have pointed out that, Schaffer in particular pointed out many years ago, that this was remarkable, that they would stand even against their own comrades in the South to refuse to draw a color line. Now, Stuart McConnell, who wrote the first great book about the Grand Army, he did not see this as anything spectacular. He felt that there was informal discrimination, and he did not feel that this was as earth-shaking as both Barbara Gannon and I feel, with our later scholarship, how important this was. I will close with this. This transformative phenomenon, both military service, combat, serving with people of all different colors, creeds, religions, genders, fosters a camaraderie, a love that is impossible to replicate in civilian life, and it has repercussions throughout the rest of their lives. Paul Melantes, the great Vietnam veteran author, in 2017, he stated that he served in Vietnam with an amalgamation of men of various races and ethnicities who needed to rely on one another to survive, just like the men of the Union. The former Marine lieutenant saw this experience as, quote, a racial crucible that played an enormous, if often unappreciated, role in moving America towards real integration. I will thank you for your attention. I'll be delighted to take any questions.
What a fantastic presentation, Mr. Goldman. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
If anybody has any questions, I wrote down some stuff I want to kind of dig into with. And I also want to talk about your website here. You got great YouTube lectures on there and interviews that I think people should definitely check out.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Okay, all right, yeah, of course. Well, you posted them, and thank God you did. So if there's a virtual raise your hand, there's two ways. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and type it in the group chat if you want me to ask the question for you. And also, you can do like a virtual hand raise, and I'll know that you want to be heard. If you don't know how to do that, just unmute yourself and try to jump in when you hear a little silence there. That's another way to do it. So you talked about I just to get started here.
Sure.
I've heard of the Freedmen's Bureau. I don't know a lot about it. You sort of mentioned it. Can you give me a little background on exactly how that started and what they did?
Sure. And again, I devote like 3 chapters to it in the book. So again, the book's all of a piece. The Freedmen's Bureau was a purely military operation, which a lot of folks don't know, which meant two things. It was poorly funded, and you had to be in active service. Well, it was arguably the most successful aspect of Reconstruction. And one of the great historians of the Freedmen's Bureau was W.B. Du Bois, and he wrote beautifully about it. It was designed to protect the rights of the freed people. And it was in sectors, it was in all the previous Confederate states, and by the way, border states. A lot of people didn't know that. It was in Maryland, 2 counties in West Virginia. It was also in Delaware, I think originally parts of DC. It was designed to have someone who would protect their rights through advocacy in the courts and with varying degrees of success. They were backed by the military. Phil Sheridan, and Phil Sheridan's interesting. As despicable as Phil Sheridan was towards Native Americans, was as marvelous as he was in support of African Americans. And Sheridan wanted Grant to unleash the army in support of the Freedmen's Bureau. They were terrified of creating a second civil war. So the backup of the military was there, but they couldn't have pitched battles. So what they did was they used the courts. One of the disadvantages they had is they were not using federal courts because they were state courts that were in place, of course. Which met with missed success, as I pointed out. They investigated the Klan. Again, Joseph Wally Galbraith being the great investigator of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who committed war atrocities at Fort Pillow, by any doubt. The Freedmen Bureau schools were probably its greatest achievement. And they led to the changes in education, North and South, that I mentioned before, by using the law, by using the courts. African American parents could sue for their children to be afforded the opportunity of public education, what white students were doing. That really started with the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's quite a story that a lot of people don't know. Does that help in terms of explaining that?
Yes, it does. And the other thing that you started talking about, something I've never heard of, was this left arm corps.
Yeah.
What am I missing here? I've never heard of this, and maybe someone else, maybe some people, maybe I've been in the dark all these years. I don't know.
No. This is why it's taken me a long time to get the first book out. So I have 2 others I'm hoping to publish the next 2 years. The Left Arm Corps was they weren't an actual unit. They were the 268 men who answered this handwriting contest proposal from William Owen Bourne, who had been an unofficial chaplain at Central Park Hospital. Central Park Hospital was a tertiary care hospital right in the middle of Central Park, New York, where soldiers and sailors who had lost limbs either got fitted for the prosthetic devices, which, by the way, were actually very good considering technology at the time, particularly the palmar arm, or get re-amputated in some cases because the original surgeries were not successful. And he became so enamored of the men with whom he counseled that he put together 2 things. He put together something called The Soldier's Friend, which was a periodical for Union veterans and their families that lasted about 3 years. And he put together, with prize money, this contest, which became so successful that they had to double the prize money. and the essays are astounding. So the first book that came out, the One More War to Fight, was actually the second book, but it came out first. The next book, which I hope will be the next book out, is the actual Civil War book, which focuses more on the Left Arm Corps and on African American troops, because they're so representative of early, almost all of them were volunteers from 61, 62. And you can follow their political radicalism along with other Union veterans and African American veterans by their experience during the 4 years of the war. And then, so the next book will end where One More War to Fight begins. There'll also be a third book that is the most psychiatric of all, in which I look at what happened to them. By the way, the last man died in 1937, which is remarkable. First one was born in 1813, last one died in 1937. And that examines the whole history of war-related stress, resilience, post-traumatic growth, and how veterans succeed. The vast majority do succeed in civilian life, and the Left Arm Corps is just a manifestation of that.
That's interesting. Thank you for elaborating on that.
Nah.
Before I go on to some other stuff I scribbled down, Kyle Purchase, one of our board members, he did our last presentation here. He wrote great presentation. Stephen mentioned the story of Henry Johnson of Zuck Post number 11 and Montgomery Cemetery refused to admit his burial. Where was he buried?
He was buried in another cemetery in Norristown, I believe. And if he wants to send me an email, I can send him what I have from the article that was in the National Tribune.
Okay, very nice. In fact, we just did a cemetery. We do a lot with the Sons of Union Veterans. We do cemetery cleanups, and we did one down in South Jersey, a place called Greenwich. They these two veterans that were buried in the woods were members of this line camp in Vineland, and they weren't allowed in their burial plot. And these guys ended up getting buried in the woods. We were out there. We got good history of it from our commander down there, who did the research. So I assume there was a lot of that going on, back then.
Yeah. Speaking of graves, my wife and I have tracked down the graves of many of the members of the Left Arm Corps all over the East and the Midwest. And as I'm sure you have done, what's so moving is what you find on the tombstones, and inevitably name, company, regiment. That's the warrior identity. That was so defining for them, their pride. And of course, the GAR symbol that's right there. And we go to Maine up until the pandemic every summer. And there's a beautiful cemetery in Greenville, Maine, with veterans going back to the Revolutionary War. And it's so moving to see flags still put on the graves of Union veterans, Revolutionary War veterans, right alongside Vietnam veterans and veterans of other American wars. That's the line that runs through this. And the work that I do, I use Civil War material to inform now and the future because the issues are the same. And the Union veterans really did establish this paradigm for people like John Kerry, who dedicated their lives to service after they returned from war because of the obligation they have to the country and to those who did not survive. And that's so powerful.
Thank you, Stephen. Mike Gabriel, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, from your talk, there seemed to be a role change between the two dominant parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, between the late 19th century and all throughout the 20th century until the 60s, et cetera. Is there a good resource for that? If we're interested in that?
Well, again, I do cover this in the book. I cover the years 1865 to 1913. And one of the things that changed the relationship between, because African Americans have supported the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln, as you can imagine, was the split that came out with the Brownsville affray, which was hot news at the time, was lost to history, where Teddy Roosevelt cashiered 197 African American soldiers on false charges of having had a night shooting down in Brownsville, Texas. I'd recommend it to you because it impacted the relationship between the Republican Party, African Americans. And one of my favorite incidents about that is when Jack Johnson, of course, the first African American heavyweight champion, campaigns against Teddy Roosevelt because of the Brownsville affair. So you can take a look at that. And then it started to, as you know, it started to steamroll. And when the Union veterans started to die out, even before they died out, there was a collective amnesia about why the war was fought. And the reason why I include lost cause in the title of the book, and I devote a lot of attention to it, the lost cause interpretation took over Civil War history. And I don't mean just 100 years ago. It's, there's still remnants of it out there. And of course, that affected the politics.
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Okay, Charles Bogart, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to jump in? Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm from Frankfort, Kentucky. I'm just going to talk a little local history. We had two GAR posts here, an African American and a white post. 1919 or so, they shift, and one becomes the white VFW post, and the other one becomes the African American VFW post. You can trace the lineage through this. And they continue on separate until roughly 1960, when the white post starts accepting, one I belong to, 4075 African Americans in. But the African American post continues with this core of people who slowly die off. And then about 2010, it disappears because this core has died off. The new people eligible for the VFW is coming over. And I've always found this a little fascinating that within our community, they marched together in the parades, they did things together, but then they were two separate posts, and then they evolved into two separate VFW posts. Just throwing that as a comment.
That's fascinating. And as a Kentuckian, you heard what I said about Richie, who testified about the acceptance of African American posts within the department and how important that was. And of course, Kentucky was a classic border state. And as you know, many of I mentioned Cairo, Illinois, which is as south as you can get in Illinois. Cairo, Illinois schools were not desegregated until the 1960s, much less the 1860s. And some of the patterns in the Midwest between the northern parts of the state and southern parts of the state, in some ways, are maintained to this day. And a lot of it really started with aspects of the Civil War. And so I'm not surprised by what the gentleman just said about remnants of things that had happened before still resonating in modern times. I'm not surprised by that. I mean, I would also point out that the veterans organizations.
Mike Cooper, I see you have.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Stephen, excellent presentation. My question is, was there any official opposition or pushback by the GAR to the Daughters of the Confederacy in the late 1800s and the early 1900s in the placement of their lost cause monuments?
Yes. In a word, the last chapter of my book is about the Lee statue ending up in the nation's capital for over 100 years. I spend 2 chapters talking about the changes in honoring the graves of Northern veterans versus Southern veterans. And one of the betrayals became the Blue and Gray societies, which suddenly, over time, removed African American veterans from the celebrations in preference for Confederate veterans. So this became part of the lost cause, as you know. And the Grand Army's greatest moment was 1891, when they refused to draw a color line. That's when the Grand Army was at its zenith, when they would not even, as I write in the book, when the Grand Army would not even pass a resolution against the placing of Robert E. Lee's statue in the nation's capital, clad in his uniform, that's when the Grand Army essentially lost its influence, because the rank and file was outraged when that happened. And again, I described that in detail. But as you're pointing out, sir, the ongoing issue of honoring graves became more and more heated as the decades after the Civil War continued, including who was decorating the graves and who was maintaining the graves. And the ones who got left out as time went on were African American veterans.
Thank you. That was great. I just want to point out to everybody, just so we wrap up, but we don't have a catastrophic failure here. We're getting a bad network connection, unstable network connection. So if anybody has their video, if they don't mind turning it off, that will help. That will take the pressure off the system. So if you could, yeah, there you go. Thanks, guys. I appreciate that, guys and gals. Now I see another person has themselves unmuted. And they muted themselves again. Oh, Bernice, Captain, did you
I just want to thank that woman for a superb presentation. I learned so much. I wish I had a really intelligent question to ask, but I don't. But I do intend to purchase your book. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled. I was able to get hooked up at last minute. I couldn't find the Zoom link, and I was panicking to the nth degree. And then some kind gentleman here from the guard got me hooked back up. Thank you. And thank you again for this presentation.
First of all, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the feedback. You had mentioned, I mean, do the folks know about the website? Because I have a lot of talks up there on different topics. By the way, I love to hear from people. My contact information is there. And it's always a thrill to do these kind of talks with people, because people, I used to joke when I was a member of the Abraham Lincoln Institute board, we could pull people out of the audience and put them on the stage and let them do presentations, because, you know, Civil War folks read so much and they're so tuned in. And what I try and do with my material is, a lot of this is brand new material, and I like to use a lot of primary material that has not been used before. In particular, the newspapers of the time, which are amazing. I also try very hard to use the soldiers' words themselves. I like to let them tell their story, because I think their stories are so important. This feedback's been terrific. Well, are there any other questions? I'd be glad to answer. Do you have the sign up?
That website is StephenGoldmanMD.com.
With a PH.
Yeah, okay. And it is, and we're going to put that up on the screen. So
Great.
We're going to make sure that's pushed. I'll also put an image of the book so people can identify it when they see it.
Yeah, it's a Winslow Homer painting, by the way.
Okay, there you go. All right. Now, you said something interesting. You said, contrary to popular belief, the National Tribune was not a GAR publication. I had never heard that it was. So what I'd like to know from you is, why do people think that? Was that something they covered extensively, so much to the point where people thought that was the
unless I have this wrong, you know, because I use Chronicling America, you know, the Library of Congress wealth of newspapers, and you know, they describe the papers. And I think at one point they called it like the House organ. And I've seen it cited in other places that the National Tribune was the actual JR newspaper, and it wasn't. As a matter of fact, they have a long mission statement where they explained that they were not affiliated with the Grand Army, even though their coverage was great. As you know, I mean, the articles are terrific. And by the way, they covered a lot of racial issues in the National Tribune. And as you can imagine, a lot of my research is using that. But I wanted to make it clear that there was no newspaper for the Grand Army. But the National Tribune did a lot of the coverage for the Grand Army. Plus, the Grand Army always published the National Encampment Records, which are quite remarkable. A lot of them are verbatim transcripts. For example, that's how I got the debates in 1891. They came right out of the 1891 report. So I always like to be accurate as to the independence of the National Tribune, that it was not a house organ, because I feel that's important, because it was an independent newspaper.
Yeah, that's that. Thank you for clarifying. Well, I never heard that, but I can see why if you keep coming across it, you're like, let's clarify that. So now you talked about Robert Pinn. Can you give me that spelling? Is it Pinn?
Yeah,
Robert
PINN,
Pinn,
yes.
the commander, Department
Yeah,
Commander, Ohio.
he was in the 5th USCT, which by the way was the 127th Ohio originally. I had one of the biggest thrill of all of this was I met his great grandson, which was amazing. Robert Pinn, I could talk and write about Robert Pinn all day long. He wrote in his essay for the handwriting contest. Robert Pinn writes that he was fighting for a black man's rights for untrammeled manhood. That was one of the reasons why I told John Sellers I have to track these men down. And what I found about Robert Pinn was remarkable, including his work as an educator in Cairo, his becoming an attorney, his trailblazing work in the Grand Army, his helping to strike down the black codes in Ohio. A man way ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And by the way, he's buried in an integrated cemetery in Mazatlan. He was lionized, like I said, even in a racist Democratic newspaper who treated him with respect. He was a leader in the city, in the town. There's 2 historical markers about him when you're there. I think he's a very important person to know about. And what he stood for was so important because he stood for integration. He stood for the meaning of military service. He stood for not reconciliation, but going forward together while never forgetting what he had faced. He couldn't even go to school in Ohio, common school, because the schools were segregated, and he ends up going to Oberlin. And by the way, I will point out that the first public university to admit African American men was my alma mater, Ohio University. And Oberlin was, of course, one of the first private universities to admit African American men, and also later one of the first to admit women in a state that still had black codes on the books. That's the contradiction. I'll be writing more about Robert Pinn.
Thank you very much. Now someone just unmuted, and I want to. Oh, Robert, did you have something you wanted to ask? Okay. Another note: Kyle Purchase, who asked a question before about the cemetery, he found Henry Johnson buried in Tremont Cemetery in Norristown, Company A, 3rd USCT. So there we go, burning up the internet while we talk here. Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's great. It's always good stuff. Well, that's what we do at the GAR Museum. We're also a research library, and if you become a member, you can utilize some of our professionals here that really do a great job in tracking down. GAR is a fascinating thing because if you do your ancestry and you look back in time, a lot of times you just get things like pension records, but the GAR did such a beautiful job of archiving everything they did that you had just census records going back in your ancestry. And then all of a sudden, if you hit on a Civil War Union veteran, the world opens up.
Yes.
And that's why these things are so important. And that's why it's so great. And I love that you took your book and you made it a lot about the GAR, or at least your presentation about your book.
Well, it is. And again, one of the reasons why I did that was they had such a high percentage of Union veterans were Grand Army members at some point. And I mean, again, estimated half. I mean, that's a huge proportion. And what I really emphasized more, frankly, than anyone had done previously was their political activism, even though they were apolitical, and that the things they stood for. I mean, it wasn't a perfect organization. There were things they did that were despicable, as I also have in the book. But on the whole, they kept the faith. They tried to make it clear why the war was fought. and not just in the 1870s. They were talking about this. I mean, like I said, the chapter I have on the Lee statue, they were outraged that a man they always considered a traitor. That's what they always said about Lee. He was no hero to them. Many of them had fought against him. And the idea that you could put a statue of him in the nation's capital is beyond belief, and would stay there for over a century. Matter of fact, one of the great quotes was, "We might as well ask New York to put in a statue of Benedict Arnold in his British uniform." And they made the point, would that last for more than 2 minutes? And you wanted something, they were absolutely right. And that's not a story that's been told. A lot of people had no idea how his statue ended. Of course, it was only removed 3 years ago. And now, of course, we've got this great discussion about what we do with Confederate statues. I'm a great advocate for placing in museums to explain the history of the statues and explaining what they were symbols of. Because as you know, most of the Confederate statues, for example, in Richmond, they didn't come up after the Civil War. That was during Jim Crow. Those were decades later. They became symbols of Jim Crow, not of the Civil War. All this is so important. And the encroachments of Jim Crow and the Lost Cause were really paralleled in a lot of ways, tragically. The other aspect, as I mentioned, is making it clear that Reconstruction was not a total failure. We got the 14th Amendment during Reconstruction, which is still the bedrock, was still the bedrock of equal rights under the law. That's still what we depend on. The 15th Amendment eliminated any possibility of the North being accused of racial hypocrisy because African-American men now had the vote. That was critical. Matter of fact, Ulysses S. Grant called the 15th Amendment's ratification the most important act ever done in the United States. Not the Declaration of Independence, the 15th Amendment. If this stuff doesn't resonate now, I don't know what does.
Thank you. I saw you get the high sign. Are you getting the "come on, we're running late" sign over there?
Nope.
Okay. Charles, I saw you're unmuted again. Is you got something you
Yeah,
want to pop in and ask?
I'm going to do a quick little commercial. The
Okay.
Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War, of which I'm a member, great-grandfather was in the 108th Ohio. We are having our national encampment in Lexington, Kentucky, the first weekend in August. So if any of you guys, sorry about this, ladies, it's only men. If any of you men have ancestors who fought in the Civil War, join the Sons, part of the GAR, and become active and come to our national convention. Okay, end of commercial.
We do have Ladies Auxiliary and the Women's Relief Corps. Let's not forget.
Right. Well, yeah, I should have mentioned them.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, you're a good brother. Thank you for bringing that up. All right,
Well,
and let's see.
the gentleman who asked about the women in the of the Confederate organizations, I will point out that the Women's Relief Corps and the women's organization of the GAR, in some cases, were even more adamant against the lost cause mentality. For example, with the Lee statue, they were among the first to protest the Lee statue, and the statue of Henry Wurz that was placed. You know, the commandant of Andersonville. So they were not without voice when it came to aspects of the lost cause. Well before they actually had the vote.
Bogart, I'm going to step back in for one more second. I've always thought it was funny is that the Northern Kentucky chapter of the Women's Relief Corps was the Hooker Women Relief Corps, named after General Hooker. Okay. They have a very nice sundial that they put in the Green Hill Cemetery in Southgate, Kentucky. If you're ever there, take a look at it.
Were they aware of Hooker's guide to the best houses of ill repute in Washington?
I don't know. I've always wondered about that. You know, I can't find much on them, but it just every time I look at that sundial and I see that little plaque on it, I just have to laugh.
Yeah, of all people, they pick Hooker.
Yeah.
See, these stories are great.
Okay, so William Chambers, do you have something you wanted to ask? Oh, he muted back up. If somebody has something they want to ask, I want you to, because I see Robert Sloan is unmuted. Just jump in now. Otherwise, we will wrap up. Stephen Goldman, you were a real pleasure. I thank you so much, and we invite you back for any book you want to come here and push, and we'll push it on our end.
No, I'd be delighted. And again, I guess I could do a little promotion. You know, I do Civil War roundtables. I do post events I'm going to be at, but I'm always delighted to speak live, truly live. And I do talk about, it's not just Civil War. Obviously, I talk about veterans issues, things like that. And this was wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been terrific.
Okay, Mary, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that in speaking about the women's groups, we also had the Daughters of the Union Veterans of the Civil War. And our 1058 members are, many of them are members of the GAR Civil War Museum. And by the way, we have coming up in June, the Allied Orders, the 5 of them that are meeting in King of Prussia, June 27th into the 30th for the convention. So it's in the neighborhood, and hopefully maybe some of you, if you're in the Allied Orders, we hope to see you there. And thank you. Great presentation. I'm looking forward to getting the book as well.
Thank you very much.
Robert Walls, who was our national historian for years at the Sons of Union Veterans, and was also just honored with being a commander-in-chief, a past commander-in-chief. A great big honor coming from the organization. He wrote a book called The Grand Army Men, which is one of these Bible things for anyone who wants to do research on the GAR. It's a very comprehensive research. And he just released Grand Army Women. And he goes through all the different women's organizations post-Civil War. So just because we're on that track, I wanted to mention that. It's a fabulous book. I ran out and bought it right away. And so did the museum. I believe the museum has a copy up there. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna put the information to go visit Mr. Goldman's website and see a copy of his book, so you can go and purchase it. And I want to thank you very much. I want to thank everybody here that came and participated. Sometimes question answers, they're just at the end. Everyone feels like they've been answered, and there's no questions. And sometimes, like today, the questions and answers really kind of brought a little more of what he had inside out for everybody. So I think today was a great success. Such a success that sometimes we come in under an hour, and we're almost going on an hour and a half. And I think that's pretty awesome. So I want to thank everybody and have a great rest of your weekend.
Yes, you too. Thanks so much for logging on.